You know what finally woke me up? I was building a bookcase a few years back, and I used MDF for the shelves because it was flat, it was cheap, and I figured nobody would know the difference once I painted it. 6 months later, the middle shelf was bowing under nothing but paperbacks. Not encyclopedias, paperbacks. And I remember standing there thinking, I cut corners, and the wood knew it. Around that same time, I had started reading about medieval woodworking guilds, the tradesmen who built furniture and structures that are still standing after 500, 600, even 800 years. And the more I learned about how they worked, the more I realized there are things in my shop right now that would have gotten me thrown out of a guild hall. Today, I'm going to walk you through 7 things you will never find in a medieval woodshop, and the reasons they were forbidden might change how you think about your own work. Plus, stick around to the end because I have a bonus tip about a medieval surface finishing technique that will make you wonder why we ever reached for sandpaper in the first place. Let me get into it. What we are really talking about today is the standards that European woodworking guilds held themselves to, roughly from the 12th century through the 17th century. These were not hobbyists. These were professionals whose reputation and livelihood depended on every single piece that left their shop. And when you understand their reasoning, you start to see modern shortcuts in a very different light. So let me give you some context on who these craftsmen actually were because I think it matters. Starting around the 1100s in cities across England, France, and Germany, woodworkers organized themselves into formal guilds. To become a master craftsman, you did not just learn a few techniques. You spent years as an apprentice, then years as a journeyman, traveling from shop to shop, and only after producing a masterwork, a single piece judged by existing masters. Could you open your own shop? The guild set strict rules about materials, methods, and quality. If you used an inferior wood species for a visible surface, you could be fined. If a piece failed within a certain period, you were held personally responsible. There was no hiding behind a brand name or a warranty card. Your name was on every joint. The philosophy behind all of this was simple but absolute. The material must be honest, and the construction must outlast the craftsman. They believed that the wood itself had integrity, and your job was to honor that integrity through your technique. Cheap substitutes and shortcuts were not just frowned upon. They were seen as a betrayal of the craft. Now, with that foundation in mind, let me show you the 7 things that would never be allowed through the door of one of these shops. And I think a few of them might surprise you. The first thing you will never find in a medieval wood shop is MDF, or particle board. And honestly, this is the one that hit closest to home for me. MDF is made from wood fibers mixed with resin and pressed into sheets. Particle board is even worse, just chips and sawdust glued together under pressure. A medieval guild craftsman would look at this material and not even recognize it as wood. And here's the structural reason why they would reject it. MDF has almost zero resistance to moisture. The moment it encounters humidity or a spill, it swells and it never fully recovers. It cannot hold a fastener with any real strength, and it has no grain structure, which means it has no natural resistance to bending. Guild craftsmen selected their timber based on species, grain orientation, and how the tree grew. They would use quarter-sawn white oak for panels that needed to stay flat, or European beech for legs and stretchers that needed to resist shearing forces. Every board had a purpose because every board had a nature. MDF has no nature. It is wood that has had every natural property stripped out of it. The second thing you will never find is polyurethane or any synthetic finish. This one took me a while to come around on because I spent years brushing on polyurethane and thinking I was protecting my work. Medieval craftsmen finished their pieces with oils, waxes, and shellac. Linseed oil, walnut oil, and beeswax were the primary finishes in most European shops. And here is what I did not understand for the longest time. These natural finishes do not just sit on the surface. They penetrate into the wood fibers and become part of the material. Polyurethane creates a plastic film on top of the wood. It looks protective, and it is for a while. But when that film cracks or chips, moisture gets underneath, and you have a problem that is nearly impossible to fix without stripping the whole piece. A linseed oil finish can be refreshed with another coat at any time, 50 years later if you want, and it blends right in. Guild craftsmen thought in generations, not seasons. They chose finishes that could be maintained by whoever owned the piece 100 years down the road. When I finally tried finishing a white oak tabletop with nothing but boiled linseed oil and beeswax, the depth of color and the way the grain came alive made polyurethane look like I had wrapped the wood in plastic wrap, because that is essentially what it is. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these old world methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called The Lost Workshop, and it is a complete guide to hand tool woodworking the way medieval craftsmen actually did it. 156 pages, 17 chapters, 33 illustrations, techniques like the ones we are covering today, and a whole lot more. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. All right, let us keep going. The third thing you will never find in a medieval woodshop is drywall screws. I know. We have all done it. You are in the middle of a project, you need a fastener, and there is a whole box of drywall screws sitting right there. But drywall screws are made from hardened, brittle steel. They are designed to hold gypsum board to a wall stud, and that is it. They have no shear strength to speak of. Put any lateral force on a drywall screw and it will snap clean in half. Medieval craftsmen used hand-forged iron nails when they used metal fasteners at all, but more often, they relied on wooden pegs. Oak pegs, called trunnels or tree nails, were driven into offset holes to draw a mortise and tenon joint tight. The wood peg flexes with the wood around it as it expands and contracts through the seasons. A drywall screw does not flex. It just sits there, rigid, waiting to either snap or split the wood around it. When I switched to using oak pegs in my own mortise and tenon joints, the first thing I noticed was how solid the connection felt. There was no play, no wiggle, just wood gripping wood the way it was designed to. The fourth item that would be strictly forbidden is using wood glue as a substitute for proper joinery. Now let me be clear, medieval craftsmen did use hide glue, but they used it as a supplement to a well-fitted joint, never as a replacement for one. Today, a lot of us squeeze yellow glue into a sloppy joint and convince ourselves it will hold, and it might for a while. But here's the difference. A properly fitted mortise and tenon joint has mechanical strength. The wood is physically interlocked. Hide glue added to that joint is just insurance. Modern yellow glue in a gap-filled butt joint is doing all the structural work, and glue was never meant to do that. Guild standards required that a joint hold together dry. If it could not pass that test, no amount of glue would make it acceptable. When I started testing my joints dry before any glue touched them, my work improved more in 6 months than it had in the previous 5 years. The fifth thing you will never find is sandpaper used as a primary surfacing tool. Medieval woodworkers brought their surfaces to a finished state using hand planes, scrapers, and draw knives. When I first started studying this, I could not understand why anyone would skip sandpaper. Then I looked at the surface of a properly planed board under a magnifying glass. The wood fibers were clean, intact, and almost polished. When I looked at a sanded board, the fibers were scratched, torn, and fuzzy. Sandpaper works by abrading the surface, essentially damaging it in progressively finer patterns. A sharp hand plane slices the fibers cleanly, and the result is a surface that takes a finish more evenly, reflects light more beautifully, and actually feels different under your hand. It took me some practice to get my number 4 bench plane tuned well enough to produce that kind of surface, but once I did, I understood why guild craftsmen never needed sandpaper. The sixth thing is pocket hole joinery. Now I want to be fair here, pocket hole jigs are useful for certain quick projects, and I still own one. But a medieval craftsman would look at a pocket hole and see a shortcut that sacrifices everything the craft is built on. A pocket hole is essentially a screw driven at an angle through an oversized hole. It relies entirely on the screw's thread gripping into end grain, which is the weakest possible connection in wood. Compare that to a through tenon with a wedged end, where the joint literally cannot come apart without destroying the wood around it. Guild craftsmen designed joints that got stronger over time as the wood dried and tightened. Pocket holes get weaker over time as the wood moves and the screw loses its grip. The seventh and final item you will never find in a medieval woodshop is dimensional lumber used straight off the rack without any preparation. Today, most of us go to the lumber yard, buy boards that are already surfaced on 4 sides, and start cutting. Medieval craftsmen started with raw timber, often logs they selected themselves. They would rive the wood, meaning split it along the grain using a froe and mallet, which produces boards where the grain runs continuously from end to end. A board that has been riven has dramatically more strength than a board that has been sawn, because sawing inevitably cuts across grain lines. Even if you are buying lumber from a modern supplier, the lesson here is to pay attention to grain orientation, to check for runout, and to let your boards acclimate to your shop for at least 2 weeks before you start cutting joinery. The medieval approach was to know your material before you ever pick up a tool. Let me share some patterns I have noticed over the years. Things I used to do myself that these guild craftsmen handled completely differently. The first pattern is reaching for the fastest option instead of the strongest one. Most of us grab pocket hole jigs, drywall, screws, and yellow glue because they are quick. But the traditional approach asks a different question. Not how fast can I assemble this, but how long will it hold together? The second pattern is treating the finish as an afterthought. I used to slap on polyurethane as the last step without thinking about it. Guild craftsmen considered the finish to be part of the material itself. The finish was chosen before the first joint was cut. The third pattern is trusting the lumber yard to do your material preparation. When you skip the step of inspecting grain, checking moisture content, and acclimating your stock, you are building on an unreliable foundation. Medieval craftsmen would spend more time selecting and preparing their timber than most of us spend on an entire project. The fourth pattern is hiding poor joinery with filler and glue. We have all done it. A gap appears in a joint and we fill it, sand it smooth, and paint over it. Guild rules specifically prohibited this. The joint either fit or it did not. There was no middle ground. The good news is, once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start changing your approach one project at a time. You do not have to rebuild your entire shop overnight. Now, for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This one comes from studying how medieval craftsmen prepared their hand plane irons, and it completely changed my results. Instead of sharpening to a single uniform bevel, many traditional European craftsmen would put a very slight camber on their smoothing plane blades. What this does is eliminate plane tracks, those faint ridges you get at the edges of each pass. With a cambered iron, each stroke feathers out at the edges and blends seamlessly into the next pass. I started doing this about 3 years ago after reading about it in a description of a German guild workshop, and the surface quality jumped immediately. You can achieve this camber by applying slightly more pressure to the center of the blade during your final honing strokes on a waterstone. It takes maybe 10 extra seconds of sharpening, but the difference in your finished surface is something you will feel the first time you run your hand across it. One more thing before I let you go. I spent a long time gathering the best traditional woodworking methods I have come across, and I put them all into a book called The Lost Workshop. 17 chapters of medieval hand tool techniques that most modern woodworkers have never seen, with 33 illustrations and clear explanations you can actually follow in your shop. Scan the QR code on screen right now, or grab it from the first link in the description. I appreciate you watching, and if you want more of these deep dives, make sure to subscribe. I will see you in the next one. Thanks for spending some time with me. Today, folks, now get out there and build something that lasts.